Okay, here we are. This is our second and final lecture on ethics, and in fact, it's the final lecture for the whole course. So, hopefully you feel like you've accomplished something by making your way through all of these lectures. Well, anyway, so let's just pick up where we left off. We gave you the historical foundation for ethics as a discipline. How have we thought about ethics as a people throughout history? Some different theories about how to define what rightness is, and so on. Well, I have to pick just one topic out of many that we could talk about in ethics to finish up. So I picked one that I think you'll find interesting. Generally, my students do find this topic to be interesting and even provocative at times, and so maybe you will as well. We're going to talk about moral conflicts. Moral conflicts. What does a person do when he is presented with a situation where it appears that moral duties conflict? What do? Are you in a situation, if you're in a situation where it seems like you have two options and both of them, in a sense, are morally wrong? What do you do with that? Is that real? We have all kinds of silly little examples like my wife says, you know, does this dress look pretty? And I don't like the dress. You know, do I say, no, I hate that, or do I say, oh, it looks great? Obviously, that's trivial. But you can imagine some situations that are not trivial at all whatsoever. You could dream up some situations like, for instance, say something terrible happens, such as someone breaks into your house with ill intent, and you hide your family in the closet, and this evil person says, where's your family? Where's your wife and kids? Now, you're not supposed to lie. So do you just say, well, they're in the back closet down the hall? Or do you say, well, they're not home, they're away visiting family, it's just me? You see the moral conflict here, because you're not supposed to lie, but also you're supposed to protect the weak, right? This is something that we're supposed to do as Christians. We're supposed to protect the weak, and so to expose the weak is wrong as well. It seems like that's a moral dilemma, a moral conflict, if you will. Which is right? Which do you do? I think most of us know what we would do in that situation. We're not really asking the question, what would you do? We're asking the question, what should you do? And what's the foundation for answering that question? And so anyway, as is usual, there's several theories associated with this. So I'm going to present you with three different theories about how to handle moral conflicts. All of these can be held by Christians and are held by Christians. You can rework these theories a little bit. There's different versions of them for folks that are not Christians, but certainly each of these views will be consistent with Christianity if you frame them in a certain way. And I'll kind of do that as we go. I'll try to show you both sides of it. But generally, I'll be thinking about these as the way Christians would hold to these different theories. Okay, well, the first theory is called the third alternative view. How do you handle moral conflicts? This is one answer. This view denies that there are real moral conflicts. They just simply say that's illusory. There's no such thing as real moral conflicts. These are just imagined scenarios. One must always look for an alternative action that would not violate any sense of morality. In other words, in that situation that I just said, in reality, there would always be some other option. Those aren't your only two choices, lying or exposing the weak. There's some other way, this view would argue. So what are some features? Conflicts are only apparent, as I just indicated. To suggest that there are real moral conflicts is to suggest that God can contradict himself, they would say. In other words, how can God command opposite duties? In other words, lying to protect the weak, and so on. There's always a way out of the situation without going against any moral standard. They would appeal to 1 Corinthians 10:13, the Christian proponents of this view would. So you might look that up and check that out. Another feature of the third alternative view is to say that we should not lie to save a life, okay? Which is the scenario that I brought up to you. The choice is not between lying and killing. You must tell the truth. And in a situation like that, the moral decision is on the part of the evil person, or the person that's breaking into the house in that scenario that I described. They're the ones who are deciding whether to do wrong or to do right. You know what you're supposed to do, the proponents might say. You're not supposed to lie, okay? You're not supposed to do that. The other person is the one with the moral problem. One must never, another feature, one must never sin to avoid another sin. One could not then commit suicide, for example, in order to avoid torture, that this is not a legitimate option for someone, because committing suicide to kill is wrong. And so you kind of see how this is framed. Let me offer some critiques to this view. And obviously I'm painting in very broad strokes, and so forgive me for not being as nuanced as I perhaps would be in another situation. Let me provide some critiques. There seems to be a naivety regarding the notion of real conflicts here, it seems to me. Even biblical examples point to real moral conflicts, I would argue. For example, Daniel 6 shows the conflict between obeying the government and praying to the king. Do you recall that narrative? The king makes this edict, passes this law that everyone must bow down and pray before him. Well, of course, this is not something that Daniel can do, but he's also supposed to obey his authorities, and this is also right. What does he do? That seems to be a real moral conflict, doesn't it? So there seems to be something going on there that we need to consider. There is a kind of implicit legalism here also, it seems. Man was not made for moral laws, but God made moral laws to help man, and being willing to lose a human life in order to avoid lying seems to be to forget this sentiment. Also, too, I don't have time to go into this very deep because time doesn't allow, but I'd like you to check this out on your own time. There seems to be such a thing as what we call weightier matters of the law, according to, say, Matthew 23:23. Look that up. Jesus speaks about what seems to be weightier matters of the law. There seems to be a sort of hierarchy there. And that's something interesting that I think needs to be addressed a little further before you could sign off on this third alternative view theory. And there does seem to be examples in scriptures where lying, if you want to get specific, is commended in a certain sense. You think, what? This sounds provocative. Let me grab my Bible here. Pardon me for moving out of camera. But you might think that I'm saying something pretty provocative here, but let me just refer to something here in Hebrews 11, chapter 30, verse 31. The writer of Hebrews refers to the Old Testament narrative dealing with Rahab, you may recall. It says, by faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And if you want to look that up and check that out, that's a very interesting Old Testament narrative. The Hebrew spies sneak in, and she hides them, and the guards come and ask if there's any spies there. She says no, of course, and they're protected, and so on and so forth. And you can read the rest of that story, but she is presented in a positive light. She had a moral dilemma there, didn't she? She could lie, or she could give up the spies, and it was her conviction that these spies were God's men, that they were here on God's mission, and so she could protect them, or she could lie, and she chose to lie, and she is not condemned for doing this. She seems to be presented in a positive light. She made this mention about look at her faith. You know, we regard her faith now as a result. Pretty interesting, and because of that, that seems to push against some of the ideas that support this third alternative view theory. Well, what's another view? Another theory about how to deal with moral conflicts. It's called the lesser evil view. The lesser evil view. This view accepts that there are real moral conflicts, unlike the third alternative view, which says that such things are just illusory. The lesser evil view acknowledges that such moral conflicts are real. And your response should be to choose the lesser of the two evils when presented with such a scenario. Now, here's the kicker with this view. Having said this, this theory still understands the lesser evil to be a sin. And so, for instance, when we were talking about Rahab, she chose the lesser of the two evils. But what she did was still a sin. Lying is still a sin, even in that situation. And so, there's some interesting features to this view. What's one? Conflicts are unavoidable. Not only are they possible, but you will surely encounter such conflicts in life. This is a reality. It's a feature of this theory. There are universal norms. Okay, in other words, those things that we call moral obligations are true without any exceptions, qualifications, or exemptions. Okay, that's the reason why they think it's still a sin to choose the lesser evil, because these things are true no matter what, no exception, qualification, or exemptions. Okay, so therefore, to choose the lesser evil in moral conflicts is, in fact, still a sin. Okay. Now, how do you understand what the lesser evil is? Well, if you're approaching this from not necessarily a Christian perspective, you could take the utilitarian approach. We discussed utilitarianism before. You could take that approach. But for the Christian, you would appeal to Scripture, of course, and Scripture being the grounding and the foundation for what is right. Okay? What are some critiques of this? This view holds people culpable, it seems to me, for the unavoidable. I mean, according to this view, these things are unavoidable, and so you're holding people culpable, guilty, as it were, for things that are unavoidable. It seems incorrect to assume that God would hold someone responsible for something that he or she cannot avoid. It also seems to imply that in the midst of a moral dilemma, a person has the duty to sin. That seems like a very strange thing to say, doesn't it? Also, too, here's something else to consider as a critique to this theory. What about what I'm calling a Christological problem? Hear me out. If moral conflicts are unavoidable, right, and both options are sinful, just one to a lesser extent, then what about Christ and his sinlessness? Of course, one feature of Christology is that Christ was sinless, okay? And it seems to me that one would have to suggest that Christ was never faced with any such dilemmas. Because if he were to be faced with such dilemmas, or such a dilemma, he would have sinned. And of course, we believe that Christ never sinned. But surely Christ, as our human example, his humanity, it seems, would be diminished if he was not presented with these kinds of dilemmas like we are. And so you can see the problem there. So it seems problematic to suggest that the lesser of the two evils is still a sin for choosing the lesser of the two evils as it regards our view of Christ, because surely he was presented with such dilemmas, and surely he did not sin. One example is Jesus and the temple. Remember, he stayed back, his parents went on, and of course his parents were beside themselves, and for good reason. Because, it seems to me, under normal circumstances, it's right for you to obey your parents. But Christ didn't do that. He knew what his parents' wishes were. He stayed back. Why? Because he had to attend to the Father's business. And it seems wrong to suggest that Jesus chose the lesser of the two evils and still sinned in that. That violates some very important principles that we hold in Christianity. So for those reasons, I think that there's some problems with the lesser of the two evils theory. Now, perhaps someone who holds that view would have some good responses to those critiques. But anyway, nonetheless, there they are. What's a third view here? A third theory as it regards how to deal with moral conflicts. It's called the greater good view. The greater good view. There's several different forms of this throughout history, but there's one way to frame it that's most consistent with Christianity, and I'll frame it in that way. In other words, this view basically argues that to choose the greater good when confronted with a moral dilemma is what you need to do. The greater good. And by the way, this greater good is based on revealed Scripture, that higher rule, so to speak, that we ascertain in Scripture. What are some features of this view, of this theory? They agree with the lesser of the two evils theory that there are real moral conflicts in life. It's not just illusory like in the third alternative view. They're real, and they're not just imagined. Another feature is one is not morally responsible for unavoidable moral conflicts. That's a major feature of this view. 1 Corinthians 10:13 is also a passage that they refer to this. That was referred to earlier. They would also appeal, just like before, to This is something I spoke about in a critique. But they would appeal to Rahab, Daniel, and those narratives, and they would look at that and they would say there seems to be some examples in Scripture of persons who were presented with moral conflicts, and they chose the greater good. What they did was not a sin; it was right under the circumstances because it was the greater good. They would appeal to that. Again, this view would point to the idea, like in Matthew 23:23, and also I'll add another verse, John 19:11, that there seems to be a kind of higher law that's established that Jesus is referring to. And so, because of all of these things, it seems right to acknowledge that that moral dilemmas are real, and that in such a situation, we choose the greater good, and that greater good is ascertained through our reading of Scripture. That's the grounding for how we conclude what is, in fact, that greater good. Some critiques to this view. This could be construed as a kind of situation ethics, some might say. But you would respond to that, it seems to me, by saying that the situation should not be used to determine rightness, but that wouldn't be right. Rather, it would just be used to discover which moral principle applies in this situation. The situation would be used in that way. This view does not commend breaking any moral commands. Rather, it views God as exempting a person from a lower command in order to obey a higher command. You see the difference. Another critique is to say that this view is a kind of relativity, okay? A kind of moral relativity. Yet, this view does not seem to negate the binding character of any moral command. Instead, God exempts someone from a particular moral command because of its unavoidability. And so that is perhaps how you would answer this critique regarding relativity. Another critique is that this theory implies a conflict in God's commands. Think about this. God commands these various things, and some of these things conflict. That seems to be a problem, doesn't it? It seems to me that you can answer this by suggesting that when God established the universe, when He created, there were no such conflicts. But because of the fall of man, that's when these conflicts were introduced. And so perhaps this is one way to answer that critique. And finally, folks might say that there's no clear ground for deciding the higher rule. But of course, as Christians, we have a way to answer that, and our grounding, of course, would be to appeal to Scripture as a revealed indicator of the higher rule. And so anyway, I hope this lecture has been interesting to you, and perhaps it will cause you to think a little bit more about this discipline of ethics, and maybe you'll do a little bit more reading in this area. That's what I would hope. Also, too, it seems to me that these lectures on ethics that I've presented you are making an appeal to Scripture as being a grounding for how we determine what rightness is. And if you don't get anything else out of these lectures except for that, then it seems like it will have been worth exposing you to this discipline, if for no other reason. Well, it's been a very good semester. I wish you well.